The Yuba case begins with a cold car on a mountain road, and tonight you have the file open beside you, under a small lamp. There is no rush here, and the old pages can turn slowly. You can picture the paper first, before the names settle in. It has that faint, dry smell of stored records, the kind that rises from folders kept too long in county rooms. The Yuba case is written in reports, maps, interviews, and silences. And we'll move through it gently, as if each page has waited for us to arrive. On the evening of the 24th of February, 1978, 5 young men from Yuba City went to a college basketball game in Chico. You see their names typed plainly in the file: Gary Mathias, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Wyha, and Jack Madruga. They were friends, all in their 20s, and all connected through a local program for people with developmental disabilities or mental health challenges. They had their own rhythms, their own loyalties, their own small plans. The game mattered to them, not because history would remember it, but because the next day they had a game of their own. They were part of a basketball team called the Gateway Gators, and they were supposed to play in a Special Olympics tournament. You can imagine the ordinary excitement of that. Sneakers by a door, a jersey folded somewhere, a mother reminding her son to sleep, a group of friends looking forward to something simple and bright. They drove in Jack Madruga's turquoise and white Mercury Montego, a car that had the solid weight of the 1970s. Its doors would have closed with a heavy sound. Its seats would have held the faint smell of vinyl, cold air, and whatever wrappers or receipts had been left behind after ordinary errands. The road from Yuba City to Chico was familiar enough, and the plan seemed simple enough. They would watch the game, maybe buy snacks, and then come home. As you sit with the first page, you notice how little seems strange at the beginning. That is often how old mysteries begin. Not with a warning, not with some sharp turn in the telling, but with a collection of common details that only become important later. A basketball game, a car, a winter night, 5 friends expected home. The Chico State game ended that night, and the men were seen afterward at a market called Bears. They bought small things, the kind of late evening food you can almost hear being placed on a counter. Candy bars, soda, maybe milk. The paper bag would have made a soft crease in someone's hand, and the air outside would have felt damp and cool after the warmth of the store. Then the file begins to thin. They did not return to Yuba City. They did not arrive home to sleep before the next day's tournament. Their families waited through the night, and by morning the waiting had changed shape. You can imagine that slow domestic unease, the untouched bed, the clock on the wall, the call that should have come but didn't. There was no grand announcement that something was wrong. There was only absence, arriving hour by hour. When you turn the page, you find the first question detectives had to sit with. Why would 5 young men, expected home and excited for the next day, drive away from the route they knew? The simplest roads between Chico and Yuba City did not lead into the high country. They led back through the valley, toward homes, families, and Saturday plans. Yet days later, Jack Madruga's car was found far from that path, high in the Plumas National Forest, near a snow line on a remote road. The car itself is one of those details that keeps calling you back. It was not wrecked. It was not hidden. It was simply stopped, left along a road where the air would have been colder, thinner, and quieter than the valley below. Snow lay around it. Trees stood close. The kind of silence you hear in winter woods is not empty, exactly. It has small sounds inside it, branches shifting, snow softening, your own breath in your ears. Detectives looked at the car and found no clear sign that it had been forced there. The Mercury had gas. It could still run. By some accounts, it seemed as if it could have been driven out if someone had known what to do or felt able to try. That is one reason the Yuba case has never rested easily. The car was both a clue and a question, a large metal object sitting patiently in snow, offering presence without explanation. You can place yourself beside the investigators for a moment, boots pressing into the roadside slush. The car is cold to the touch. The windows hold the dull reflection of pale sky. Inside are traces of the men's ordinary evening, wrappers, belongings, the residue of a trip that should have ended in a driveway. The road around you does not answer. It only continues into trees. In those early days, searchers began the work that cold country demands. They looked along roads. They checked ditches, slopes, cabins, and clearings. The weather did not make the work easy. Snow changes everything. It covers tracks, softens edges, hides small objects, and turns distance into something heavier than it looks on a map. A mile in snow is not a mile on paper. You feel that as you read. The families were not reading it yet as a mystery people would discuss for decades. They were living it as a missing persons case, with every hour mattering in the plainest human way. You can feel the difference. A later reader has the whole file, or thinks they do. A family has a telephone, a porch light, and the unbearable habit of listening for a car. The five men were not strangers to one another. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were close. Jack Hewitt was quiet and gentle by many descriptions. Ted Wire was known as someone who could be cautious, even fearful, and deeply attached to routine. Gary Mathias had served in the army and had been treated for schizophrenia, though he was considered stable when taking his medication. Each man becomes easy to flatten in retellings, but the file asks us not to do that, so we slow down with them. We let each name remain a person, not a puzzle piece. We remember that the Yuba case is not only about a car in the wrong place, it is about 5 families trying to understand why the night did not return their sons and brothers. It is about detectives standing in cold air with limited tools, limited daylight, and a question that would not hold still. At first, investigators had to consider ordinary explanations. Perhaps the men had become lost. Perhaps they had taken a wrong turn, followed another car, or misunderstood the road. Perhaps someone suggested a route and the others went along. In a group, small decisions can gather weight quietly. You know that from your own life, maybe. Someone says, "Let's try this way," and for a while, no one objects. But the route toward the mountains was not a small detour. It carried them far from where they were expected to be. The road wound upward into colder country, toward forest and snow, and away from the valley roads that would have taken them home. Detectives could trace the geography. They could measure distance. What they could not measure was the decision inside the car. When we sit with that part of the Yuba case, we must be careful. It is easy, years later, to speak as if a map should have solved everything. But people do not move through maps the way lines move on paper. They move through darkness, conversation, confusion, habit, trust, fear, and sometimes pride. They move through what they think is true in that moment. The night was late. They had been to a game. They had stopped at the store. The Mercury's headlights would have reached ahead in 2 pale cones, catching road signs, trees, and the uneven shine of wet pavement. Inside the car, the heater may have hummed. Someone may have opened candy. Someone may have been thinking about the game tomorrow. The file cannot tell us who spoke or what was said. That is where patient detective work begins, in the space between what is known and what can only be approached. You do not fill that space too quickly. You let it stay open. You place each fact beside the next, like photographs on a table, and you wait to see which edges align. Days passed, and the search continued. The cold held the mountains in place. Snow and distance slowed everything. Searchers could not simply sweep the entire forest as if it were a room. They had to move by road, by trail, by what weather allowed. The winter landscape kept its own counsel. It received voices, engines, and footsteps, and then grew quiet again. One of the hardest things in this file is the waiting. Not the dramatic kind, but the real kind. A detective drives back from a search area with wet socks and no answer. A mother goes another evening without news. A deputy types a report that says less than everyone hoped it would say. The paper dries. The phones ring. The file grows one page at a time. Then spring began to loosen the snow. As the season changed, the mountains gave back more than they had given in winter. In June of 1978, searchers found a Forest Service trailer, sometimes called a camper or a cabin in retellings, about 19 miles from where the Mercury had been abandoned. It stood in the woods near a place called Daniel Zinc Camp, and the discovery shifted the Yuba case into a deeper uncertainty. You can imagine opening the door after months of weather. The air inside would have been stale, cold in the corners, carrying the smell of dust, damp wood, and old food. Light would have entered in flat strips. Objects would have seemed both ordinary and strange, because in a place connected to missing men, even a can opener can feel like it has been waiting to speak. Inside, searchers found the body of Ted Weher. We keep the words gentle here, because Ted was a person before he was a finding in a report. He had been in that trailer for a long time. He had lost a great deal of weight. The person did. Searchers found the body of Ted Weher. We keep the words gentle here, because Ted was a person before he was a finding in a report. He had been in that trailer for a long time. He had lost a great deal of weight. His beard had grown. His feet were affected by exposure, and his shoes were not on him. These are difficult details, but the important part for our quiet reading is what they suggested to investigators. Ted had survived for some time after the men left the car. That fact changed the shape of the file. The case was no longer only a question of why the men went into the mountains. It became a question of what happened after they arrived, who reached shelter, who knew about the supplies inside, and why help never came. In the trailer were food supplies, enough that some investigators believed Ted, or anyone with him, might have lived longer if all of it had been used. There were blankets. There were ways, perhaps, to make the situation less desperate. And still, the answer did not come. When you sit with that trailer in your mind, you may notice how quietly painful the details are. There were canned goods. There may have been heating fuel or equipment that could have helped, though not necessarily in a simple way. The Forest Service building was not a home, not a staffed refuge, not a warm cabin with someone waiting. It was a remote place in winter country, and understanding what was usable would have required calm, knowledge, and strength. Detectives had to ask whether Ted had been alone there. They had to ask whether others had come with him and then left. They had to ask whether the men knew what resources were available, whether they were too frightened to search, too disoriented to act, or whether something else had happened before any of this. The file does not let one question stay alone. Each question brings another. Nearby, searchers found remains later identified as Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling. Jack Madruga was found closer to the abandoned car. Gary Mathias was never found. His shoes were reportedly in or near the trailer area, which deepened the uncertainty around his last known movements. You can feel how the file resists becoming neat. It gives enough to keep thinking, never enough to settle. The families had to receive these pieces of news not as theories, but as grief. That matters. We can discuss distances and timelines, but each discovery arrived at a home, at a kitchen table, at a person who had been waiting since February. The Yuba case asks for careful language because speculation can become careless quickly, and these men were loved. So we return to the method. Detectives compared statements, weather records, maps, and witness accounts. They worked with what existed in 1978, before cell phones, before digital location trails, before roadside cameras became common. If a car went into the mountains then, it did not leave a glowing path behind it. It left tire marks if the road allowed. It left impressions in memory if someone happened to see it. It left silence. There were reported sightings, as there often are. Some people thought they had seen the men, or the car, or something connected to them. Detectives had to listen without surrendering judgment. You can imagine the desk work in that part of the investigation. The scratch of a pen, the clicking of a typewriter, the soft thump of a receiver being set down after another call that might matter or might not. One account that has received much attention came from a man named Joseph Shons, who said he was in the mountain area that night after experiencing trouble with his own vehicle. He later reported seeing headlights, hearing voices, and calling for help. His account has been discussed many times because it places activity in the area during the hours when the 5 men may have been nearby. Yet, like so much in the Yuba case, it did not open the whole door. You read that account slowly, because it is easy to ask more of it than it can give. A person in distress, at night, in cold country, may hear and see things imperfectly. Distance changes voices. Trees break sound. Headlights appear, vanish, and return around bends. What seems close may be far away. What seems certain later may have been uncertain in the moment. Still, detectives could not ignore it. They had to ask whether the men had passed near him. They had to ask whether they heard him. They had to ask whether someone else was there. The old reports do not become more generous because we wish them to. They remain what they are, typed pages with dates, names and margins, carrying human memory as carefully as paper can. This is one reason the Yuba case stayed unresolved. The facts were not absent, but they were misaligned. The car was found in one place. The trailer was in another. Some remains were found along distances that implied movement through harsh terrain. Gary Mathias vanished completely. The road choice remained unexplained. The available supplies in the trailer raised more questions than they answered. A case can be full of evidence and still refuse to become clear. You might think of detectives returning to the same map, tracing routes with a finger, from Chico to Yuba City, from Yuba City to the mountains, from the abandoned Mercury to the trailer, from the trailer to where each man was found. The paper map would crease at the folds. Pencil marks would darken. Coffee might cool beside it. Outside the office window, another ordinary day would pass. The mystery was not only where they went, but why they went there. That question is soft in shape, but hard in substance. It contains fear, choice, confusion, friendship, and maybe an influence from outside the group. It contains the possibility of a wrong turn that became worse, and the possibility of some event we still do not know. Detectives could test roads. They could interview people. They could not replay the conversation inside the Mercury. The men's personal histories became part of the investigation, though they had to be handled with care. Their disabilities and vulnerabilities may have affected how they responded to being lost, cold, or afraid. Gary Mathias's mental health history drew attention, sometimes too much attention, because unresolved cases often search for a single person to carry the explanation. But Gary had reportedly been doing well, taking part in ordinary life, and looking forward to the basketball tournament like the others. You can feel the unfairness in making one man into an answer simply because he is not here to speak. A patient reading does not do that. We can acknowledge that Gary's history mattered to investigators, while also remembering that history is not destiny. It does not tell us what he did that night. It does not explain a mountain road by itself. The same care belongs to Ted, Bill, Jack Hewitt, and Jack Madruga. Their routines, fears, friendships, and habits mattered. Ted was known to be dependent on familiar supports and deeply connected to his family. Jack Madruga owned the car and had served in the army. Bill Sterling and Jack Hewitt were close friends. These details help us see them as people moving through an ordinary Friday night, not shadows in a legend. As you turn another page, the paper feels heavier, though nothing physical has changed. The official investigation had to move between compassion and procedure. Search teams could not search forever in the same way. Detectives could not treat every rumor as fact. Families wanted answers, and rightly so, but answers require something firmer than longing. So the case became a pattern of searching, interviewing, comparing, and waiting. It became a file that stayed alive because no one could make it whole. The abandoned car remained central. Its condition troubled investigators from the beginning. If it had fuel, if it could run, why leave it? If the men were frightened or confused, why walk deeper into cold rather than return down the road? If snow blocked the way ahead, why not turn around? Each question sounds simple when spoken indoors, in a warm room, long afterward. In the mountains, at night, simplicity may have felt very far away. There is also the question of the road itself. Some reports describe the car being stopped on a rough or snowy mountain route, beyond where many drivers would casually go in winter. Jack Madruga knew his car, and those who knew him did not think he would willingly damage it. That observation stayed with investigators. It suggested that either he did not understand where the road was leading, or something made the usual caution fall away. You can imagine the Mercury moving slowly over rough ground, the suspension creaking, the tires pressing through patches of snow and mud. Inside, the men may have grown quiet. The heater's breath would have filled the car, then thinned whenever a window opened or a door shut. The road would have looked different in headlights than it did by day. Less like a route, and more like a narrow strip of permission. At some point, the car stopped. That small sentence carries more weight than it should, but we let it remain plain. The car stopped. The men got out, or some of them did. They left the relative shelter of metal and glass. They moved into the cold. Whether they moved together or separated later, whether they believed help was close, whether they were following lights, voices, or a mistaken idea of direction, we do not know. Detectives could work backward from what was found. They could estimate distances, review weather, and study the terrain. They could ask how long Ted may have survived in the trailer. They could wonder why more food was not eaten, why heating was not used more effectively, why no clear signal for help was made. But every backward path eventually reached the same blank space. What did they think was happening? That is the part no report can fully restore. The file can hold their names and locations. It can hold the date and the vehicle. It can hold the weather and the search results. It cannot hold the private feeling inside a cold, frightened moment. It cannot tell us whether someone said, "This way," or "Wait here," or "I see something ahead." When we keep the narrator's lamp low and stay with the Yuba case patiently, we notice how much detective work depends on humility. Not theatrical humility, but the ordinary kind that admits when the record stops. A good investigator can be persistent without pretending certainty. A good reader can sit with an unanswered page and not force it closed. By summer, the file had become both clearer and more confounding. 4 of the 5 men had been found. Gary Mathias had not. The families had some answers, though not the one answer they most needed. The physical search could continue in pieces, but the first urgent phase had passed. The mountains had been walked, scanned, and questioned in all the ways available then. The Yuba case moved into a slower stage. This is where many cold cases begin their long second life. The first weeks are full of motion, engines starting before dawn, officers checking leads, searchers calling across gullies. Then the pace changes. Reports are filed, evidence is stored, people return, as much as they can, to work and meals and sleep. But the case remains, sitting in a cabinet, waiting for someone to ask again. You can picture the folder years later. Its corners are soft. The typed ink has lost a little darkness. Some pages carry handwritten notes in the margin. perhaps from a detective who paused over the same inconsistency we're pausing over now. The smell is paper, dust, and a faint trace of metal from the cabinet drawer. When you lift it, the folder has the weight of things unresolved. The question of outside involvement has never fully disappeared. Some have wondered whether the men were persuaded, chased, misled, or frightened into taking the mountain road. There is no established proof that this happened, but detectives had to consider it, because the route made so little sense in light of the plans waiting at home. A mystery does not become stronger by adding strangers to it, yet it would be careless to refuse the question entirely, so we hold it lightly. We do not turn possibility into fact. We simply note that investigators could never explain the initial turn toward the mountains. If another person or vehicle played a role, the evidence did not make that clear. If the men acted alone, the reason did not survive with enough detail to be recovered. Either way, the missing explanation stayed at the center of the file, quiet and stubborn. The terrain itself became part of the answer and part of the obstruction. Snow can preserve, and snow can erase. Forest roads can seem passable until they are not. Distances between shelter, vehicle, and open road can feel different depending on weather, clothing, strength, and fear. You can stand in the same place in June and fail to understand what February demanded. That is why patient investigators return not only to maps, but to conditions. They ask what the road looked like then, not now. They ask how deep the snow was, how cold the night became, how visible the trailer might have been, and whether a tired person could have seen it from a distance. They ask small questions because small questions are sometimes the only honest tools left. The Yuba case does not reward grand theories for very long. Each one runs into a plain, stubborn detail. If the men were merely lost, why that road? If they found shelter, why were supplies not used fully? If Gary left the trailer, where did he go? If someone else was involved, where is the trace? You can feel the file gently resisting every answer, not with drama, but with incompleteness. That incompleteness is why we stay slow. There is a kind of respect in not hurrying past uncertainty. The families had to live with it, not as entertainment, but as part of daily life. Detectives had to carry it as unfinished work. Communities around Yuba City remembered the men not only through the strange circumstances, but through the ordinary human fact that they were missed. A cold case is never cold to everyone. You may imagine a detective, years after the first search, taking the file down again. The office is quieter now. The phones are different. The cars outside are different. Maybe computers sit on desks where typewriters once sat. Yet the same old photocopies remain. The same names remain. Gary, Bill, Jack, Ted, and Jack. 5 friends in a car after a basketball game. The detective reads the witness accounts again, because that is what patience looks like. Not brilliance in a flash, but repetition with care. The same sentence, read today, may feel slightly different than it did years ago. A detail once considered minor might connect to a road, a time, a habit, or a weather report. Most days it does not. Still, the page is turned. In the Yuba case, time did not bring the kind of forensic breakthrough that has solved other long mysteries. There was no single preserved sample that could simply name an unknown person. There was no clear crime scene in the usual sense, no complete timeline, no surviving witness who could explain the turning point. The case lived in movement, weather, memory, and absence, and those are difficult materials to test. That does not mean investigators failed in some simple way. It means the conditions were unforgiving. The men disappeared in a remote winter landscape, before modern tracking and surveillance. The discoveries came months later, after weather and animals and time had altered the scene. The most important decisions happened without a recorder, without a camera, and without anyone left able to describe them. You can feel how quietly old this mystery has become. Not old like something finished, but old like a wooden desk, polished by use. People have leaned over it for years. They have traced the same roads, asked the same questions, and tried to hear the missing conversation inside the mercury. The Yuba case remains because each answer offered to it leaves something outside the frame. And so we go back again to the beginning, not to solve it quickly, but to understand why it stayed unsolved. A Friday night in February, a college basketball game in Chico, a store stop afterward, a drive that should have led home, a car found high in the mountains, a trailer discovered when the snow had gone soft and thin, 4 men found, 1 still missing, families waiting first for news, then for understanding, and receiving only part of each. That is the shape of the file as it rests under your hand tonight. You can rest your fingers there for a while, at the edge of that shape, and notice how the Yuba case keeps returning to the same quiet hinge. Before the mountain road, everything still belongs to ordinary life, with gym lights, store shelves, cold soda bottles, and the soft paper sound of a receipt being folded. After the mountain road, everything becomes distance, weather, and unanswered movement. We sit at that hinge tonight, not trying to force it open, but letting it show us how carefully detectives had to work. The evening in Chico had its own small texture, and you can almost hear it if you let the file slow down. A college crowd leaving a basketball game makes a layered sound. Shoes on concrete, car doors opening, voices carrying through cool air, the far-off engine noise of people going home. The 5 men would have left with the plain satisfaction of an outing completed. You can imagine them talking about the game, or about the next day, or about nothing very important at all, because most lasting mysteries pass through ordinary talk before they enter silence. When detectives later followed that part of the Yuba case, they were not only looking for dramatic clues, they were trying to build a last known normal hour. You look for receipts, store clerks, parking lot memories, and anyone who might recall a turquoise and white Mercury passing under streetlights. The work is modest. It asks strangers to remember a night that did not seem special when they lived it. By the time the questions arrive, the smell of the store is gone, the cash drawer has been counted, and the evening has joined all the others. The stop at Bear's Market mattered because it fixed the men in time after the game. You can picture the fluorescent light inside, pale and steady, shining on candy wrappers, glass cooler doors, and the smooth worn counter where small purchases were made. They were not hiding. They were not acting like men vanishing from their lives. They were buying snacks after a game, and if you stand with that fact for a moment, it gives the mystery a softer and sadder weight. Detectives had to treat every ordinary detail as potentially useful. Which way did the car leave the lot? Did anyone seem upset? Did any stranger appear nearby? Did any of the men mention another stop? You can almost feel the detective's notebook in your hand, the cover flexible from use, the pen moving quietly as another witness says they do not remember much. That is not failure. That is how memory works when the moment has not yet announced itself as important. In the Yuba case, the gap after the market became one of the largest empty rooms in the file. The drive home should have been simple, and because it should have been simple, every other possibility becomes hard to hold. You may trace the valley route with your eyes, and then lift your finger toward the roads that climb into the Plumas National Forest. The paper offers both paths without emotion. It does not tell you what happened inside the car when one path was chosen over the other. There may have been conversation or confusion or an instruction someone believed. There may have been a mistaken turn that no one corrected soon enough. You and I cannot hear those voices now, and detectives could not hear them then. All they could do was place themselves at each possible decision point and ask what the men might have seen. A road sign in headlights, a bend that looked familiar, a pair of taillights ahead, a darkness that did not yet feel dangerous. The weather becomes important here, not as a dramatic force, but as a steady presence. February in that country can carry damp valley chill and mountain cold in the same night, and you can feel the difference as the road climbs. The air outside the mercury would have sharpened. Breath would have clouded. The windshield might have held a faint film from the heater, and the glass would reflect dashboard lights back into the car like small green islands. If you have ever ridden at night through unfamiliar rural roads, you know how distance changes after dark. A few miles can feel longer. A wrong turn can remain invisible until the landscape has already changed. The Yuba case asks us to remember that human beings do not make choices from above, looking down at a map with all roads equally clear. They make them from inside a moving car, with headlights reaching only so far. Still, investigators had reasons to doubt a simple wrong turn. The distance was too great, the route too unlikely, and the men had homes and plans pulling them back toward Yuba City. You can feel the pencil pause over that part of the report. If a wrong turn began the movement, why did it continue? If uncertainty began the drive upward, why did certainty not return at some point in the form of turning around? These are quiet questions, but they do not go away. The car's owner, Jack Madruga, becomes especially important in that section. He was known to care about his Mercury, and people close to him did not think he would casually take it over rough winter roads. You can imagine the detective listening to that description, not as gossip, but as practical context. A man's habits can become evidence. The feel of a steering wheel, the known limits of a car, the reluctance to scrape the underside on frozen ruts, all of it helps shape what seems likely. And yet, habits can bend under pressure. You and I have to leave room for that, because the file leaves room for it. A cautious driver may continue if he believes stopping would be worse. A group may keep going because no one wants to admit fear. A person may follow another voice, or another set of lights, or an idea that seems reasonable for 5 minutes, and then becomes difficult to reverse. Patient investigation lives in those shaded possibilities. When the Mercury was found, it was not found as a smashed or destroyed vehicle. It sat on the mountain road with a strange plainness, and that plainness gave detectives more trouble than obvious damage might have done. You can stand beside it again in your mind, hearing the muted crunch of snow under boots, feeling the cold metal of the door handle through a glove. A car that can still stand whole can ask more questions than one that clearly cannot. Reports have often noted that the car had fuel and was not hopelessly disabled. Some accounts suggest it may have been stuck in snow or mud, yet not so badly that it was impossible to move. You can see why this troubled investigators. If the men could have stayed inside, why leave? If they left to seek help, why go the way they did? If they believed shelter was nearby, how did they know? And if they did not know, what drew them onward? Inside the car, the ordinary remnants mattered. Snack wrappers, maps or personal items, small things left behind in the hurry or confusion of departure, each one carried a little of the evening forward. You can picture a detective leaning into the cold interior, smelling vinyl, old sugar, damp cloth, and the mineral chill of snow outside. There is no answer in a wrapper, but in a case like Yuba, even a wrapper helps confirm the men had come from the place witnesses said they had been. The snow around the car was both evidence and obstacle. If tracks had existed, weather could soften them, cover them, or make them impossible to read with confidence by the time searchers arrived. You know how snow takes impressions and then changes its mind. It rounds edges. It fills holes. It turns the path of a person into a faint unevenness that may be gone by morning. Detectives could not demand permanence from winter. Searchers faced terrain that did not fit neatly into a grid. Forest roads curve, climb, and split, and the trees can make a short distance feel hidden. You can imagine the search teams moving slowly, coats brushing branches, radios crackling with thin voices, cold air reddening hands and faces. Each call into the woods would go out and return smaller. The landscape was not hostile in any dramatic sense. It was simply large, cold, and indifferent to urgency. The families, meanwhile, were living in a different kind of landscape. Their rooms were familiar, but nothing in them felt settled. You can imagine a kitchen table with a cup left untouched, a telephone watched too closely, a jacket hanging where someone expected its owner to return. The Yuba case was not yet a famous phrase. It was a set of missing sons, missing brothers, and missing friends, and that is where our attention should remain. As investigators learned more about the 5 men, they also learned about how strongly the next day's basketball tournament had mattered. This was not a minor plan easily forgotten. You can feel the ache of that detail, because a scheduled game gives the night a direction. The men were expected somewhere. Their clothes, routines, and families were arranged around that expectation. For detectives, that expectation became evidence that whatever happened after Chico was not part of a planned disappearance. The Gateway Gators were a source of pride. The name itself feels local and affectionate, the kind of team name that would appear on a schedule, a t-shirt, or a gym bulletin board. You can picture the floor of a community gym, the polished wood smell, the squeak of shoes, the echo of a ball bouncing under highlights. The 5 men were moving toward that ordinary joy when the road turned away. That contrast never stops mattering. When detectives interviewed relatives and friends, they were gathering more than facts. They were gathering the shapes of everyday life. Who would panic in the cold? Who might take charge? Who trusted whom? Who knew the area or did not? You can hear those interviews in a quiet room. Voices low, chairs shifting, someone stopping to collect themselves before answering again. The emotional texture of the work was inseparable from the practical work. Gary Mathias's background drew particular attention, and the file must be handled carefully there. He had served in the army, had experienced mental illness, and had been treated with medication. Some later discussions have tried to make his history the central explanation, but you and I should move more patiently than that. Detectives could consider whether Gary's state of mind mattered without turning him into a convenient answer. A diagnosis is not a map of a night. By accounts available to investigators, Gary had been functioning in the community and taking part in normal activities. He had friends, he had plans. He was with the others, at the game and the market. You can imagine his name on the same team list, his movements woven into the group rather than separate from it. The fact that he was never found makes him feel distant in the file, but he was present in the evening's ordinary beginning. Ted Wire's life also deserves that same care. He was often described as gentle, dependent on family, and uneasy away from familiar routines. You can picture a parent knowing the rhythms of his day with intimate precision, knowing what comforts him, what worries him, and when he should be home. For detectives, these details could inform theories about how he might respond in a remote place. For us, they remind us that Ted was not an abstraction inside a trailer. He was loved. Bill Sterling and Jack Hewitt were close, and their friendship follows us softly through the file. In cases like this, friendships can matter in practical ways. People stay together, wait for each other, or follow someone because trust has already been built over many ordinary days. You can see them not as figures moving on a chart, but as men who knew each other's voices, habits, and silences. That knowledge may have shaped what happened, even if we cannot see exactly how. Jack Madruga, as the driver and car owner, remains close to the central question. What did he believe he was doing as the Mercury climbed? Did he think the road would connect somewhere? Did he feel pressured, guided, or simply mistaken? You can imagine his hands on the steering wheel, the dashboard glow on his knuckles, the attention required to keep a heavy car steady on a rough road. That image is quiet, but it stays. The Yuba case has sometimes been called strange because the facts resist ordinary explanation, but strangeness can be a lazy word if we let it do too much work. Detectives could not file the matter under strange and move on. They had to ask whether each choice could be explained by weather, fear, group dynamics, misunderstanding, or outside influence. You can do the same tonight, slowly, without demanding that one explanation carry the whole burden. Group decisions can become difficult to reconstruct because responsibility spreads out. One man suggests, another agrees, a third stays silent. Someone worries, but not loudly enough to stop the car. You may have felt smaller versions of this yourself, during a wrong turn or a confusing trip, when the group keeps moving because stopping would mean admitting nobody knows. In the Yuba case, such ordinary human patterns may have had grave consequences, though the file cannot confirm them. The road into the mountains would not have been equally alarming at every moment. At first, it may have seemed less familiar, then colder, then rougher. By the time the men recognized the difficulty, if they did recognize it, turning around may have felt harder than continuing. You can see how a mistake does not always feel like a mistake while it is still unfolding. But the distance again complicates that thought. They did not merely drift a block or two from the route home. They ended up far enough away that detectives had to ask how long the decision went unchallenged. The file gives no conversation, so we return to physical facts. Fuel, road, snow, car condition, distance to the trailer, distance to the bodies found later. Each fact is set down like a small stone in low light. When spring opened the search area, the Forest Service trailer became the next central room in the Yuba case. You can approach it slowly in your mind, as searchers did after months had already passed. The snow was no longer the same solid winter cover. The air may have smelled of wet earth, thawing needles, and the slightly sour odor of closed structures. A remote building after winter has a particular stillness, as if it has been holding its breath. The trailer was roughly 19 miles from the car by road, though cross-country distance and actual travel conditions are more complicated. You see that number written in the file, and then you translate it into tired steps, cold hands, uncertain direction, and darkness under trees. 19 miles on a map is a measurement. 19 miles in winter, for frightened men without proper preparation, becomes something very different. Detectives had to respect that difference. Ted's presence in the trailer showed that at least one of the men reached shelter, and that fact gave investigators both hope and sorrow in retrospect. You can imagine the questions forming almost at once. How did he arrive? Was he helped? Was he left there? Did others remain with him for a time? The building contained food, and some of it had been eaten, yet much apparently remained. That detail has troubled people for decades. Food in a remote shelter sounds, from a warm room, like an obvious solution. But you and I have to be careful again. Cans require tools, strength, knowledge, and initiative. Supplies may be hidden, frozen, unfamiliar, or overlooked. A person in shock, fear, illness, or confusion may not act the way a later reader expects. Detectives had to consider all of that, even as they asked why more was not used. The smell of metal cans and dusty shelves does not answer by itself. There were blankets in the trailer, and investigators believed some had been used. The detail is quiet and human. You can picture rough fabric, perhaps stiff from cold, pulled around shoulders or arranged over someone lying still. In old case files, blankets often become more than objects. They become signs of care, improvisation, or need. We cannot know who placed what where, but we can notice the tenderness implied by anyone trying to keep warm. The question of heat in the trailer is another patient knot. Some reports suggest there were means to produce warmth, though not necessarily means that the men understood or could safely operate. You can almost feel the cold inside the structure, a cold that settles into the floor and climbs through shoes. If the air outside was sharper than the air inside, the trailer may still have felt like refuge. But refuge is not the same as rescue. If others were with Ted there, their later movements remain unclear. If Gary Mathias was present, the discovery of shoes associated with him near the trailer area has long deepened the uncertainty. You can imagine detectives studying that detail with great care. Shoes are intimate evidence. They carry size, wear, mud, scent, and habit. In cold country, they also carry urgent meaning, because a person without proper footwear faces the land differently. Gary's absence left the file open in a way the other discoveries did not. 4 families eventually received the devastating certainty that their loved ones had been found. Gary's family did not receive that same physical answer. You can feel how different that is. Not knowing whether a person lies somewhere undiscovered or somehow moved beyond the known search area creates a second kind of waiting. The Yuba case remains especially unresolved because of that absence. Searchers found remains of Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling in the broader area and Jack Madruga nearer to the car. The location suggested that the men did not all remain together until the end, though exactly how and when they separated is uncertain. You can trace those locations with a careful finger and feel the ache in the spaces between them. Each point on the map is not merely a clue, it is a life brought back into view. The terrain between those points could have altered everything. A slope that seems mild in daylight may be punishing in snow. A road that looks obvious from above may disappear behind trees at ground level. You can hear branches scraping coats, the soft collapse of snow underfoot, the tired breath of people trying to keep moving. Detectives had to turn geography into possible human experience, and that is slower than measuring distance. The file does not tell us whether the men planned to walk to help or simply followed a direction they believed was right. It does not tell us whether someone stayed with someone else out of loyalty or whether fear separated them. You may sense the limits of language here. Words like walked, separated, and reached are too clean for what winter travel may have been. The real experience would have been colder, heavier, and more confused than any report can hold. In those first searches and later discoveries, investigators were also working against the passing of time. Weather had months to rearrange small evidence. Animals, thaw, runoff, and human search activity could all alter scenes. You can imagine a detective looking at an object and wondering whether it lay where it was dropped, where it was moved by snowmelt, or where later forces placed it. The file is full of facts, but each fact has a weathered edge. That is why certainty remained difficult. A neat reconstruction would require knowing order, timing, intent, and condition. Detectives had fragments of each, but not enough to lock them together. You and I can sit with the fragments and see why the case endured. It was not that no one cared. It was that the mountain held too many missing intervals, and the surviving evidence could not speak in complete sentences. The witness account from Joseph Shons remained one of those intervals that seemed almost to speak, but not quite. You can place him on that cold night, reportedly dealing with his own trouble in the mountain area, hearing or seeing activity that he later associated with the missing men. His account included headlights and voices, elements that feel vivid in retellings. Yet a detective has to ask not only what was remembered, but how memory formed under stress and cold. Night sounds in forested country can be misleading. A voice may carry through trees, then seem to come from another direction. Headlights can flare through branches and vanish behind curves. You can sit in a disabled vehicle and feel the world shrink to breath, pain, cold, and whatever hope appears down the road. If Shons called out, and if the men were nearby, did they hear him clearly? If they heard, did they understand? The file leaves the question open. Some versions of the story suggest he heard what sounded like people, perhaps including a woman's voice, or more than one group, but such details have shifted in public discussion. We should be gentle with them. Detectives would have needed to separate original statements from later retellings, because old cases collect extra dust as they travel. You can almost see the difference between a first report, typed close to the event, and a later memory repeated under the pressure of attention. That pressure matters. Once a case becomes known, every detail seems to invite interpretation. People want a hidden pattern. They want the one witness, The one car, the one sentence that solves the road. But the Yuba case did not yield that. It offered reported sounds in the dark, a car on a mountain road, a remote trailer, and the hard patience of investigators who had to keep possibilities separate from proof. There may also have been reports of other vehicles or people in the region, as there often are when police widen a search. You can imagine the calls coming in, each one beginning with uncertainty. I may have seen. I think it was. It could have been. A detective writes it down because respect for the work requires listening. Then the detective checks what can be checked, and many leads fade softly into the background. Fading does not mean useless. Sometimes a lead that proves false still helps define the boundary of the case. It tells you where the answer probably is not. You can feel the slow narrowing of a field, not by revelation, but by patient elimination. This vehicle was not connected. That sighting came at the wrong hour. That memory belonged to another day. The remaining unknowns become fewer, perhaps, but no easier. The families had to hear some of these possibilities too, and that is its own burden. Each lead can lift hope and then set it down again. You can imagine a mother or brother learning that someone might have seen the men, then waiting for the follow-up, then absorbing another quiet no. In old mysteries, hope is not a single event. It rises and recedes many times, wearing at people in a way outsiders rarely see. In the offices where the Yuba case was worked, the tools were ordinary and limited. Paper maps, landline calls, typed reports, physical searches, interviews recorded in notes or memory. You can hear the typewriter keys striking, the phone bell cutting softly through a room, the drawer slides of a filing cabinet opening under fluorescent light. There was no digital trail to request, no cell tower record, no GPS dot glowing in the mountains. Modern readers sometimes forget that absence. We are used to movement leaving traces. Cars pass cameras, phones connect. Purchases time-stamp themselves in databases. In 1978, a group of men could leave a basketball game, buy snacks, and drive into the night with almost no automatic record following them. You and I have to place ourselves in that older world, where investigation depended more heavily on witness memory and physical discovery. That older world gave detectives fewer tools, but it did not make them careless. They still had procedure. They still had interviews, searches, autopsy findings, vehicle examination, and the accumulated practical knowledge of local officers and volunteers. The difference is that each step took more manual effort. You can picture a deputy driving a road simply because there was no other way to know what could be seen from it at night. Maps would have been unfolded and refolded until the creases softened. Search areas would be marked, discussed, and adjusted. You can smell paper, coffee, wet wool, and the faint dust of office heat. Someone would compare times. Someone would call another county. Someone would return to a family with careful words, trying to be honest without adding pain. The work was human all the way down. One of the hard things about the Yuba case is that it sits between accident and mystery. If the men had simply become lost and succumbed to exposure, the story might be deeply sad but more easily classified. If there had been clear evidence of another person forcing events, the investigation would have had a different direction. Instead, the case rests in a middle place, where misadventure, vulnerability, group dynamics, and possible outside influence all remain in conversation. Detectives often dislike middle places because they resist closure. You can eliminate one extreme without proving the other. You can doubt a theory without disproving it entirely. You can feel a detail is important and still not know what it means. The Yuba case became one of those files where disciplined uncertainty was necessary. It would have been easier to choose a single story. It would not have been more honest. As you sit with the mountain road again, you may notice that the car's position seems to ask the first practical question. Why leave shelter? A car is not warm forever, and fuel can run down, but it is still a recognizable refuge. Its windows block wind. Its horn might attract attention. Its body can be seen from the road. Yet the men left it, and their leaving suggests they believed something about the situation that we do not know. Perhaps they believed help was close. Perhaps they thought they were nearer to a familiar place than they were. Perhaps someone saw a light or structure, or thought a road led down toward safety. You can hear the quiet uncertainty in every perhaps. A detective may write possible, but possible is not proof. The file allows us to imagine their reasoning only as a set of careful shadows. The walk from the car toward the trailer, if that is what happened, would have required endurance. Snow reflects faint light, but it also hides depth. Clothes become damp, feet lose feeling, fingers stiffen. You can feel the roughness of bark if someone steadied himself against a tree, the cold sting in the lungs, the way sound narrows when people grow tired. These sensory facts matter because they remind us that decisions were made inside bodies under stress. The men were not experienced winter survivalists as far as the record suggests. They were young men returning from an evening out, not prepared for a night in the high country. You can imagine the mismatch between their clothing and the terrain. A jacket good enough for a car ride may fail in open snow. Street shoes may become heavy and wet. Hunger, confusion, and cold do not make thinking clearer. Detectives had to factor in that human limitation. At the trailer, the pattern becomes even harder. Ted survived there for some time, which means the building offered shelter, but not rescue. Food existed, but not enough was used, or not used in the way later observers expect. Blankets existed, but cold still dominated. You can stand in that room and feel how a place can be both life-saving and insufficient. The walls keep out wind. They do not solve fear, illness, isolation, or confusion. If one or more of the men left the trailer to seek help, the decision might have seemed necessary. If they stayed, they risked remaining undiscovered. If they went, they risked the forest. You and I know the search would eventually find the area, but they did not know that inside the moment. Old cases often remind us how cruel hindsight can be. It gives later readers a map, and then asks frightened people why they did not use it. This is why compassionate narration matters. The Yuba case is not a riddle made for cleverness. It is a human event made difficult by darkness, weather, vulnerability, and missing information. You can ask hard questions without judging the men for failing to behave like people in a training manual. Detectives who knew the case closely would have understood that distinction. Good investigation requires imagination, but also mercy. Over the years, theories have gathered around the case because silence invites them. Some believe the men were chased or frightened into the mountains. Some believe they followed a mistaken route. Some wonder whether Gary's behavior influenced the group. Others focus on Sean's account or on the possibility of another vehicle. You can set these theories on the desk like separate folders, each with its own label, and notice that none contains every missing page. The outside force theory tries to explain why the car went where it did. It gives the men a reason to leave the known route, but it struggles if no clear trace of threat, pursuit, or confrontation appears in the evidence. You can feel the appeal of the theory because it answers the first why. Yet detectives need more than appeal. They need witnesses, physical traces, consistent accounts, or admissions. Without those, the theory remains a shape in fog. The wrong turn theory is quieter and perhaps more ordinary. It suggests confusion, misnavigation, and decisions that compounded slowly. It fits some human patterns, especially at night in unfamiliar road networks. But it has its own difficulty, because the men traveled so far from the expected route and continued into rough conditions. You can see why investigators could not simply close the file with a shrug. A wrong turn may begin a story, but here it must explain a great deal. The group dynamics theory sits somewhere between. It imagines that one person's confidence, fear, or insistence influence the others, not through force, but through trust or uncertainty. You may recognize that as possible in ordinary life. Groups often move according to the person who sounds most certain. In the Yuba case, however, we cannot know who that person was, or whether such a moment happened at all. The car preserved no conversation. The theory involving Gary Mathias often appears because Gary remained missing, and because his history was known. But you and I should handle that with particular caution. A missing man is not an explanation simply because he cannot answer. Mental illness can affect behavior, but it does not automatically create a chain of events, leading 5 people into mountains. Detectives could consider it, but compassion asks us not to let a label replace evidence. The survival confusion theory focuses on what happened after the car was left. It asks whether the men reached the trailer exhausted, frightened, and unable to use what was available effectively. It asks whether Ted was cared for by someone who later left, and whether Gary's shoes suggest movement we still do not understand. You can see how this theory addresses the shelter, but it still begins after the Central Road mystery has already occurred. So the Yuba case remains a set of partial explanations. One may explain the road, another may explain the car, another may explain the trailer. None comfortably explains all of it. Detectives know that this can happen. A single case may not have a single simple cause. It may be a chain of mistakes, conditions, fears, and chances, each link small enough to seem ordinary until the chain is seen from the end. The patient investigator's task is not to choose the most satisfying story, but to respect the strongest evidence. You can imagine sitting with a legal pad, drawing columns for known, reported, inferred, and unknown. The known column is shorter than anyone wants. The reported column is complicated. The inferred column must be handled gently. The unknown column is wide, and it stays wide no matter how many times the file is read. There is a humility in leaving that column visible. It may feel unsatisfying, but it is honest. You do not close a cold case by making the unknowns smaller on paper than they are in life. The Yuba case became enduring because its unknowns are not decorative. They are structural. Remove them, and the story collapses into speculation. Keep them, and the file remains difficult but truthful. As years passed, the case entered public memory under names like the Yuba County Five, though the geography of the discoveries reaches beyond a simple county label. You can hear how names simplify complex things. A title helps people remember, but it also smooths the edges of place, jurisdiction, and lived experience. Detectives did not work a title. Families did not grieve a title. They lived with 5 names, and the roads those names could not explain. Public attention can preserve a case, and it can also distort it. You may find the same detail repeated differently in different retellings. A distance altered, a motive implied, a personality made too simple. That is why tonight we keep returning to the slow file. We let the paper and terrain restrain us. We notice when a fact is firm, when a memory is reported, and when a theory is only a way of trying to soothe the mind. The men's vulnerabilities are often mentioned, but they should not be treated as the whole story. Each man had limitations. Yes, but also preferences, abilities, friendships, and family ties. You can hold both truths at once. A person can be vulnerable and still be fully individual. A person can need support and still have agency. The Yuba case asks for that balanced attention, because flattening the men makes the mystery easier at the cost of making them less real. When investigators spoke with families, they likely heard small details that never became famous. Favorite foods, habits around bedtime, a way of laughing, a fear of certain roads, a confidence behind the wheel. You can imagine those details entering notebooks, perhaps not as evidence in the courtroom sense, but as human context. The sound of a mother's voice may not solve a case, yet it tells the detective why the work matters. The file also contains the quiet reality of rural and mountain search work. Volunteers may have known the land better than maps did. Officers may have relied on local memory, on hunters, road crews, forest service personnel, and people who understood seasonal access. You can smell gasoline from search vehicles, wet gloves drying near a heater, and the clean resin scent of pines carried into a station on someone's coat. Investigation is often made of such practical textures. The Forest Service trailer itself would have been understood by people familiar with the area, but perhaps not by lost travelers. A remote maintenance or service structure is not the same as a marked public shelter. If you are cold, tired, and frightened, you may not search every cabinet, understand every supply, or trust every piece of equipment. Detectives had to ask what the men could have known, not what a trained worker would have known by daylight. That distinction applies to the heating question too. A stove, fuel source, or other heating method may seem obvious to someone who uses such equipment. It may seem dangerous or incomprehensible to someone else. You can feel the rough handle of a metal fixture, the smell of old fuel, the uncertainty of whether turning something will help or harm. In a remote shelter, knowledge can be as important as the object itself. Food supplies raise similar issues. Canned goods hidden in storage may not be found. Large containers may be difficult to open. Frozen or unfamiliar food may not feel usable. Ted's condition and the possibility that others were caring for him complicate the matter further. You can imagine someone opening one can, then another, rationing without knowing how long rescue might take. Later readers may say they should have eaten more, but later readers are warm. This does not erase the mystery, it simply softens our certainty. Detectives could still be puzzled by the unused supplies. They could still ask whether the men were too confused, too weak, too frightened, or absent from the trailer for longer than assumed. The Yuba case remains unresolved precisely because compassionate explanations and troubling facts sit beside one another. Neither removes the other. We keep both on the table. The discovery timeline shaped public understanding. The car appeared first, and for a while, the men remained missing. Then the spring and early summer discoveries brought answers no one wanted and questions no one could avoid. You can feel how the emotional rhythm must have moved for families, from urgent search to fearful waiting to partial certainty to lifelong uncertainty. That rhythm does not fit neatly into headlines. For investigators, each discovery required new documentation, location, condition, clothing, nearby objects, weather effects, possible movement. You can imagine the careful measuring, the subdued voices, the field notes written with cold or tired hands. Even when the facts were painful, the work had to stay steady. A case can be treated with dignity through precision. Precision says, this person mattered enough for us to record the truth carefully. The search for Gary Mathias did not produce the same final discovery. That absence has made him central in many later theories, but it also means his family carried a separate uncertainty. You can imagine searchers scanning slopes, creek beds, roadsides, and wooded areas, knowing that one more finding might change the case again. The land did not give him back, whether because he moved beyond the searched area, because conditions hid him, or because something else occurred. The file remains open around his name. Missing remains in mountainous terrain are not as uncommon as people wish. Snowmelt, vegetation, animals, and difficult access can hide a person for years, sometimes forever. You can know that and still feel the particular ache of Gary's absence. The Yuba case asks us to hold practical explanation and emotional weight together. A landform can explain why something is hard to find. It cannot make the waiting easier. As the years continued, investigators and journalists returned to the same few anchor points. The Chico game, the market stop, the mountain road, the mercury, the trailer, the unused supplies, Gary's missing body. You can hear the rhythm of those points almost like a slow bell. Each one rings, and then the silence after it remains. The case endures because the space between those points has never been filled. It is tempting to imagine that one forgotten report could solve it. A witness misfiled, a road worker's note, a photograph in a box. Sometimes cold cases do turn on such things, and detectives know to keep looking. You can picture an archive room, cool and dry, with cardboard boxes stacked under humming lights. A hand pulls a lid free, dust lifts in the beam. For a moment, every old page feels capable of changing the story. But patience also means accepting that many boxes contain only what was already known. The same interviews, the same maps, the same frustrating gaps. The detective reads them anyway, because reviewing a case is not wasted simply because it does not produce a breakthrough. It keeps the facts from drifting. It honors the people involved. It gives memory a disciplined place to stand. In the Yuba case, the absence of a clear criminal act complicated official categories. Was it a disappearance, an accident, a misadventure, a possible foul play investigation, or some blend that never settled? You can feel how classification affects resources, expectations, and public language. Yet the family's need was simpler than any category. They wanted to know why the men did not come home, and what happened in the cold after the road turned. The more we sit with the file, the more the word why divides into smaller questions. Why did they leave Chico in that direction? Why did they climb into the mountains? Why did the car stop where it did? Why did they leave the car? Why did some reach the trailer? Why were supplies not fully used? Why was Gary never found? Each question has its own room, its own dim lamp, its own stack of papers. You do not have to solve each room tonight. You only have to walk through them quietly. That is the sleep shape of this story, if there can be such a thing. We are not chasing an answer through dark hallways. We are moving slowly through an old file, letting each unanswered question rest where it belongs. The Yuba case has waited for decades. It can wait while your breathing slows. Still, the detective in you may return to the first road choice. It is natural. Everything later depends on it. You may imagine possible triggers, each one small and human. A suggestion from someone in the car, a belief that a shortcut existed, a desire to avoid something on the usual road, a following of lights, a moment of confusion after leaving the store. None can be confirmed, but each shows how ordinary uncertainty might begin. A shortcut theory often appears in discussions, though the geography makes any true shortcut back to Yuba City doubtful from the roads involved. You can picture someone thinking a mountain route might reconnect if they misunderstood direction or distance. Road knowledge is uneven. A person may know one familiar route very well and still be lost one turn away from it. Detectives would have asked whether any of the men had reason to know or misunderstand the area. The idea of following another vehicle also lingers. Headlights ahead at night can feel reassuring. If a driver is uncertain, staying behind another car may seem safer than stopping. You can imagine red taillights floating through the dark, appearing and disappearing around curves, offering a temporary sense of direction. If that happened, the other vehicle may have been unrelated, unaware, or never existed in the way later speculation imagines. The file does not say. Fear of something behind them is another possibility, but it asks for evidence the case has never clearly provided. You can imagine detectives listening for any report of conflict at the market, any sign of argument after the game, any witness who saw distress. Without such support, fear remains possible but unanchored. In patient work, an unanchored possibility is not thrown away, but it is not allowed to steer the whole investigation either. The men's expected tournament continues to pull against all theories of voluntary wandering. You can almost see the next morning waiting for them, with gym doors, polished floors, uniforms, and familiar faces. That waiting morning is one of the strongest quiet facts in the Yuba case. People who plan to disappear do not usually prepare for a game. People who are excited for tomorrow do not usually choose a remote winter road without a reason. And yet, people can be diverted from tomorrow by tonight. That is the difficult truth. A sudden problem, a mistake, a misunderstood road, a frightening interaction, or a confident suggestion can overpower plans. Detectives had to leave room for interruption. The lives waiting in Yuba City show what should have happened. The car in the mountains shows what did happen. The bridge between them is missing. When you imagine the Mercury's interior during that unknown bridge, keep it ordinary. No dramatic music, no sharp shadows, just the low engine sound, the heater, the smell of snacks, the dull shine of the dashboard, and 5 young men moving through a night they did not know would be studied. Someone may have been tired, someone may have been quiet, someone may have laughed. The file cannot preserve those small sounds, but respecting them keeps the men human. At some point, perhaps the road grew worse. The car may have moved more slowly. Snow may have appeared along the edges, then under the tires. You can hear the change in sound as pavement gives way to rougher surface, the muffled scrape, the dull bumps, the way passengers shift in their seats. A driver who cares about his car would notice. That is why Jack Madruga's habits matter again. Something kept the car moving. If they stopped to assess the road, the cold would have entered quickly when the doors opened. A dome light may have glowed. Breath would have shown. Someone might have stepped out and tested the snow with a shoe. You can feel how quickly warmth drains from a car when uncertainty enters. The decision to continue or leave may not have been made all at once. It may have been a series of small adjustments. Once outside the car, the men were in a world with fewer cues. Headlights no longer extended ahead unless the car remained running and aimed. The forest has its own darkness, layered and uneven. Snow can brighten the ground while trees hold the sky dark above it. You can imagine them listening for distant engines, voices, or water. A person in that setting may choose movement because stillness feels too much like surrender. The trailer, if found after a long walk, must have seemed like an answer at first. A structure means walls. Walls mean less wind. A door means inside. You can feel the relief that might come from crossing a threshold, even into a cold and dusty room. But once inside, new problems begin. What is here? What can be used? Who is hurt, weak, or frightened? How long until someone comes? Ted's survival there suggests time passed in a suspended way. Days may have blurred, light through windows, cold nights. The smell of cans, blankets, damp clothing and closed air. You and I should not press too hard on those hours, because they belonged to suffering people, and the record is incomplete. But detectives had to consider them carefully, because the trailer held the only evidence of extended survival after the disappearance. The growth of Ted's beard, his weight loss, and the state of the supplies all indicated duration. Investigators could estimate, but estimates are not perfect clocks. You can imagine them consulting medical findings, weather information, and the condition of the scene. Each piece narrows the possible window, but not enough to show who stayed, who left, and when. Time in the trailer remains one of the quietest and hardest parts of the Yuba case. If Gary's shoes were in the trailer area, and if he left wearing different footwear or none adequate for the terrain, his later path becomes even more mysterious. You can picture detectives studying the shoes not as symbols, but as practical evidence. Were they removed for comfort, warmth, injury, or exchange? Did someone else wear them? Were they left because he changed into something found there? The questions are small and stubborn. Shoes in cold cases often feel personal. because they hold the shape of a body's movement. The worn sole tells you about gait. The dampness tells you about terrain. The placement tells you something, though not always what you want. In the Yuba case, the shoes have become part of Gary's silence. They suggest presence or proximity, but they do not say where he went afterward. They remain at the edge of an unanswered path. The trailer also raises the question of signaling. Why did no one make themselves more visible? Could they have? Did they believe they were hidden? Were they too weak? Did they think rescue would come to the car, not the trailer? You can imagine the difficulty of being in shelter, but not knowing how to be found. A remote building can save you from wind and still keep you out of sight. Search efforts may not have reached that exact location during the earliest phase, or may have been limited by snow and access. You can feel the frustration of that after the fact. 19 miles from the car, by road, is not nothing. Searchers were making decisions under pressure, with weather and terrain limiting the possible. Later, when the trailer was found, the question of why it had not been found earlier would have been painful. Yet search work is never omniscient. In wooded winter terrain, a structure can remain unseen, surprisingly close to a search path. Snow changes access. Roads may be closed or unclear. Aerial searches depend on visibility, canopy, weather, and the color of what lies below. You can picture a plane or helicopter passing over a white and green landscape, the eye trying to separate shapes at speed. What seems obvious in hindsight may have been hidden in the moment. Hindsight is one of the soft dangers in this case. It whispers that someone should have known, should have turned back, should have searched there, should have opened that cabinet, should have used that fuel. Sometimes should is useful, because it teaches future practice. But when spoken too easily, it becomes unfair to people who were cold, frightened, limited, or working with incomplete information. You and I can let the word soften before it hardens into judgment. The detectives could not avoid hindsight, but they could discipline it. They could ask what was knowable at the time. They could compare decisions to procedures, not to impossible knowledge. They could learn from the case without pretending that learning meant the answer had been easy. The Yuba case teaches patience partly because every stage looks clearer after the snow has melted and still remains unresolved. As public memory grew, the case acquired a haunting quality, but our telling tonight keeps its feet on the ground. The real mystery is not a legend in the trees. It is a set of human decisions and conditions that detectives could never fully reconstruct. The cold was real. The road was real. The car, the trailer, the unused supplies, and the missing man were real. That is enough. We do not need to decorate it with dread. The family's persistence also belongs in the file. Families often become unofficial archivists of cold cases, holding photographs, clippings, dates, and corrections long after official attention has moved elsewhere. You can imagine a drawer with old newspaper articles folded soft at the creases, a photograph kept where it can be reached, a name spoken in the present tense by habit or love. The Yuba case lived in those private archives as much as in police records. For detectives, family memory can be both resource and responsibility. A relative may remember a phrase, a fear, a plan, or a habit that helps interpret evidence. At the same time, investigators must be careful not to turn grief into pressure for unsupported conclusions. You can hear the careful tone required in those conversations. It is the voice of someone who wants to help, but will not pretend to know what the file has not shown. The case also reminds us that people with disabilities or mental health histories deserve better than simplified storytelling. The 5 men were sometimes described by old terms that can feel blunt or diminishing now. You and I can recognize the era's language while choosing more careful words. They were men with individual lives, and some had developmental disabilities or psychiatric histories that may have affected vulnerability. None of that reduces their dignity. That dignity changes how we read the decisions. If the men became lost, their vulnerabilities might have made the situation harder. If they were frightened by someone, their trust or confusion might have mattered. If they reached shelter, their ability to use supplies could have varied. These are investigative considerations, not judgments. The file asks us to understand capability with nuance, because capability can shift under stress. You can imagine the 5 of them earlier that evening, before any of these considerations entered the record. They are simply friends going to a game. The gym is loud. The seats are hard. The air smells faintly of popcorn, varnished floor, and winter coats warmed by bodies. Someone cheers. Someone waits for the final whistle. No one in that room knows that detectives will later try to reconstruct the ride home with aching care. The market stop has the same quality. It is ordinary enough to break your heart if you sit with it. Candy, soda, perhaps a small carton of milk, the simple items of a lake drive. You can hear coins or bills exchanged, a bag rustling, the clerk moving on to the next customer. In the Yuba case, that ordinariness is not background, it is the last clear surface before the water deepens. After that, investigators depend on traces. A possible witness here, a road there, a car found days later, weather records, family statements, search findings. You can feel the difference between a witnessed life and an inferred one. Before the market, the men are seen. Afterward, detectives must infer. Inference can be careful and useful, but it never fully replaces the comfort of a witness saying, "Yes, I saw them here, and they were all right." The longer a case remains unsolved, the more people ask why detectives could never crack it. That question can sound accusatory, but in the Yuba case, it may be more accurate to say the evidence never cracked open enough for them. The central events happened in darkness, in motion, and in a remote place. The recovery came late. The surviving record lacked the one voice or object that could connect beginning to end. A cracked case usually has a pressure point, a confession, a forensic match, a surviving witness, a document that changes the timeline, a trace that names a person. Here, the pressure points gave way into more questions. You can press on the car and reach the road mystery, press on the trailer and reach the survival mystery, press on Gary's absence and reach the missing person mystery. Each part opens, but not all the way. That is why detectives could revisit the file and still find no final route through it. They could improve understanding without solving the whole. They could say the men likely left the car and moved through snow. They could say Ted reached the trailer and survived for some period. They could locate several of the men, but the first cause, the sequence of separations, and Gary's fate remained beyond the evidence. You can feel how different that is from a simple failure. In many cold cases, investigators know exactly what evidence they lack. Here, they lacked several kinds at once. They lacked the interior conversation of the car. They lacked clear tracks preserved from the first night. They lacked an early discovery of the trailer. They lacked Gary's remains. They lacked any proven outside actor. The absence was layered. Layered absence is difficult to explain to the public because people prefer a single missing key. Detectives may say, "We do not know," and listeners may hear evasion. But sometimes "we do not know" is the most precise statement available. You and I can sit with that without impatience. The old file does not become less worthy because it refuses performance. It becomes more human, in a way, because human life often resists tidy reconstruction. The mountain road itself can be seen as a character only if we remember it has no intention. It did not lure anyone. It did not hide answers on purpose. It was simply there, cold and remote, with snow along its edges and trees standing in their long dark rows. You can hear wind moving through branches, not as a warning but as weather. The road received a car and later received searchers. It said nothing to either. Maps, however, let us return without freezing. You can unfold one in your imagination and place the men's route against the safer valley roads. The paper is smooth under your palm, with printed lines in different weights and colors. A detective might mark Chico, Yuba City, the car location, and the trailer. The markings make the case appear orderly for a moment. Then you remember that the actual night had no labels floating above it. That gap between map and lived experience is one of the file's lessons. A map can show that a choice was wrong. It cannot show when the choice began to feel wrong to the people making it. It cannot show whether pride, fear, trust, confusion, or hope kept them moving. Detectives could drive the route afterward, perhaps more than once, but they could never become the 5 men in that car on that night. Driving the route in daylight would provide some information and miss some feeling. Driving it at night might bring back the darkness, but not the same weather, the same group, or the same state of mind. You can imagine investigators trying anyway. Headlights catching a sign, tires rolling over roughness, a turn appearing later than expected. Each observation helps, but none becomes the missing conversation. The case's endurance also comes from the unsettling coexistence of rational possibilities. Nothing supernatural is needed. Nothing theatrical is required. A set of vulnerable men, a wrong or influenced route, a winter road, a disabled or abandoned car, a difficult walk, an underused shelter, and a missing final path are all within human reality. Yet because the order and motive remain unclear, the whole sequence feels suspended. Suspension is difficult for official records. A case file wants dates, locations, names, and statuses. It can record missing, found, unidentified, closed, open. It is less comfortable recording uncertainty as lived experience. You can imagine the typed lines trying to be firm, while the margins carry doubt. The Yuba case may be one reason old detectives keep thinking after the paperwork stops. Some files do not leave the mind politely. There is also the matter of community memory. Yuba City and the surrounding region would have absorbed the case in a local way before it became known more widely. People may have remembered where they were when the car was found, or when the later discoveries were reported. You can picture quiet conversations in stores, offices, and homes, voices lowered not because of spectacle, but because the families were near enough to be imagined. Local knowledge can preserve details that official summaries omit. It can also preserve rumors. Detectives had to move between those carefully. A neighbor's memory might be valuable. A repeated story might have changed each time it was told. You can feel the work of separating them, like sorting thin papers that cling together from age. Pull too fast, and they tear. Move slowly, and you may save what matters. The names of the men should keep returning as we read. Gary Mathias, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Wire, Jack Madruga. Repetition here is not dramatic. It is a way of refusing to let the case become only terrain and theory. You can say each name softly, as a detective might while reviewing a timeline. 5 names, 1 car, 1 night, and many years of unanswered care. The file may also contain photographs, and photographs have their own silence. A car in snow, a road under trees, a building in the woods, family photos from before the case. You can feel the difference between investigative photographs and personal ones. One records location and evidence. The other records presence. Both can be hard to look at for long, because each shows something words cannot entirely hold. If you imagine a detective handling those photographs, notice the restraint. No flourish, no dramatic gesture, just careful fingers at the edges, a glance to compare one image to a map, a note made in the margin. The paper may be glossy or matte, curling slightly with age. Under office light, snow in a photograph can look flat and almost peaceful, which is misleading. The cold inside that image was not flat at all. This is why sensory detail matters in our quiet reading. It keeps the case from becoming a diagram. The cold metal of the mercury. the stale air of the trailer, the damp weight of clothing, the grain of a map under a finger, the smell of old paper in a file room. These things bring us back to the human scale, where detective work actually happens, not in theories alone, but in rooms, roads, and weather. As we continue through the Yuba case, the next patient question is not simply what happened, but why each known fact failed to settle the matter. The car failed because it showed location without motive. The trailer failed because it showed survival without sequence. The supplies failed because they showed possibility without explaining use. Gary's absence failed because it widened the unknown instead of narrowing it. Each clue opened the file further. That is a hard pattern for investigators. Usually a major discovery reduces uncertainty. Here, each major discovery both answered and expanded. Finding the car confirmed the mountain route, but made the route stranger. Finding Ted confirmed survival, but made the unused supplies stranger. Finding the others confirmed movement, but made the separation stranger. Not finding Gary kept one entire branch of the case alive, still reaching into the dark. You can feel why a detective might return to the earliest interviews after each discovery. New facts change old questions. A witness who seemed minor might matter more once the car is found. A family comment about fear of cold might matter more once the trailer is known. A habit around shoes might matter more once Gary's footwear is discussed. Cold case work often moves this way, not forward in a straight line, but back and forth across the same pages. Back and forth is not wasted movement. It is how meaning is tested. You read a statement, then a map, then the statement again. You compare a time estimate with weather, then return to the estimate. You let the file teach you its own rhythm. The Yuba case has a slow rhythm, heavy with return, because none of its central facts stands alone long enough to answer itself. There were also institutional limits. Agencies have finite staff. Search operations cost money and time. Old cases compete with new needs. You can respect the persistence of investigators while recognizing those limits. A file may remain open in principle while active work slows. That does not mean indifference. It means the case has entered the long corridor where new movement usually requires new evidence, a new witness, or a new way to interpret what already exists. New technology has solved some old cases, especially where biological evidence, fingerprints, or preserved samples can be re-examined. The Yuba case, however, is not built around an unknown offender's trace in the usual way. You can see why that makes modern breakthroughs harder. If the central mystery is route, decision, exposure, and disappearance, DNA may not answer the first why. A tool can be powerful and still not fit the lock. That is another reason detectives could never fully crack it. The case did not leave the kind of evidence most likely to benefit from later science. It left geography, witness memory, and partial recovery. It left a missing man, whose discovery might still matter, but whose absence gives no sample to compare against an offender. You and I can notice how some mysteries endure, not because nobody tried, but because the available evidence belongs to a category. Time does not easily improve. Witness memory often weakens with time, but sometimes conscience strengthens. Someone may decide to speak years later. Someone may find an old note. Someone may remember a car, a conversation, or a road condition. Detectives know this, which is why cold cases remain open to calls. You can imagine the phone ringing in a records unit decades after the first search, and someone still taking down the information carefully, because even late details deserve to be heard. Most late tips do not solve a case. That is the quiet truth, but they keep the channel open between past and present. They say the men have not been entirely forgotten. They give investigators one more chance to compare memory with record. In the Yuba case, where so many questions depend on unseen movement, even a modest credible memory could matter. The difficulty is finding one that can be verified after so many years. Verification is the patient heart of detective work. A story may feel right and still be wrong. A theory may feel odd and still be true. You can picture the investigator holding both possibilities without leaning too quickly. Where was the witness? What time was it? How do they know the date? Did they tell anyone then? Can the road conditions support it? Does it fit with the car, the trailer, and the known sightings? The Yuba case punishes shortcuts in reasoning. If you decide too quickly that they were merely lost, you may ignore the oddity of the route. If you decide too quickly that Gary caused everything, you may ignore his humanity and the lack of proof. The file asks for a slow mind. Tonight, that slow mind is exactly the one we bring. You may notice how often the word perhaps appears in this case. Perhaps they turned by mistake. Perhaps they followed someone. Perhaps they were frightened. Perhaps they sought help. Perhaps they reached the trailer together. Perhaps Gary left later. In sharp writing, perhaps can feel weak. In careful investigation, perhaps marks the boundary between evidence and imagination. It is a small word that keeps us honest. Honesty can be soothing in its own way, not because the story is happy, but because the telling does not strain. We do not need to pretend certainty. We do not need to create urgency. We can sit beside the old record and let it remain unresolved where it is unresolved. The Yuba case has lived many years with that condition. Our task is not to cure it with language, but to understand its shape. The shape includes the family's unanswered questions, which likely changed over time. At first, the question was, where are they? Then what happened? Then why? Then, for Gary's family especially, where is he? Over years, questions can become part of a person's inner furniture. You may not think them every hour, but they are there when a date returns, when a photograph is found, when someone mentions the mountains, or when a story appears again in public. Anniversaries are often difficult in cold cases. The 24th of February would not be just a date on a calendar for those families. It would carry weather, memory, and the knowledge of the last ordinary evening. You can imagine the season itself becoming a reminder. Winter light, damp roads, basketball schedules, the smell of cold air at night. Time passes, but it passes over certain dates with a different sound. Detectives, too, may remember cases by season. A winter disappearance, a spring recovery, a summer review. The file is dated, but memory adds temperature. You can picture an older investigator thinking of snow when he hears the names, or of the trailer air when he sees the map. The body remembers work, the paperwork has finished. That is part of patient detective work we rarely name. The Yuba case also shows how rural distance can protect mystery. In a city, movement may be witnessed by many people without anyone noticing. In the mountains, movement may be witnessed by no one at all. A road can be empty for long stretches. A car can pass without being recorded. Footsteps can vanish into snow and meltwater. You can feel the openness of that space, not dramatic, just wide enough to keep secrets by accident. Accidental secrecy is one of the hardest kinds. No one has to plan it. Weather, darkness, and sparse traffic do the work. Detectives can be diligent and still arrive after the landscape has changed. Searchers can be brave and still miss a structure. Families can speak publicly and still receive no answer. The Yuba case rests heavily on that kind of accidental concealment, where no single person may hold the missing key. Yet the possibility that someone did know something has never fully disappeared. It is possible that a driver saw the mercury, possible that someone encountered the men, possible that a small interaction went unreported because it seemed meaningless at the time. You can imagine a person years later wondering if that car they passed mattered. Memory may offer only a color, a bend in the road, a feeling of headlights in the mirror. Detectives working such a lead would have to be careful not to stretch it beyond its strength. A turquoise and white car is distinctive, but not unique. A winter night on a mountain road may be remembered because of later news rather than because of direct observation. You can hear the questions again. How certain are you? When did you first remember this? Did you tell anyone? What else happened that night? The work is gentle, but firm. The case's unresolved nature also affects how people imagine the five men's final decisions. Some imagine panic. Some imagine loyalty. Some imagine one man helping another. Some imagine confusion so deep that ordinary options vanished. The file cannot confirm the emotional truth of those moments, but you and I can choose the most respectful frame. We can assume they were doing the best they could within fear, cold, and limited understanding. That assumption is not evidence, but it is humane. It keeps the telling from becoming judgmental. It reminds us that survival situations are not exams people take under fair conditions. They are moments when bodies and minds narrow. A person may overlook food, fail to light heat, leave shelter, or choose a wrong direction, not because they are foolish, but because distress changes the field of possible thought. In the Yuba case, distress may have met pre-existing vulnerabilities. Some of the men may have had difficulty adapting to sudden uncertainty. Some may have relied on routine or trusted companions. Some may have found the mountain environment overwhelming. Detectives could consider these factors, while still recognizing individual strength. Vulnerability does not mean helplessness. It means conditions matter more. And the conditions that night were severe. As we turn the pages, you may begin to feel how the file is built from contrasts. Warm gym, cold road. Familiar valley, remote forest. Car shelter, open snow. Food present. Hunger still present. Bodies found. Gary missing. Many facts, no final answer. These contrasts are not arranged for drama. They are simply what the case contains. We let them sit quietly beside one another. The next page might be a map again, or a typed interview, or a newspaper clipping softened by age. You can feel the slight resistance as paper slides against paper. A clipping may smell different from official stationery, more brittle, with ink that leaves a faint grey dust on fingertips. Public reporting and official records overlap, but they are not the same. A careful reader listens to both, then returns to the primary facts when the story begins to drift. Newspaper accounts helped keep the case visible, but early reporting may include details later corrected or misunderstood. You can imagine reporters working under deadlines, calling officials, speaking to relatives, trying to explain a confusing case in limited space. They were part of the record, but not the whole record. Detectives would have known that public narratives can harden quickly, even around uncertain details. That hardening is why we keep the tone soft. Soft does not mean vague. It means precise without pretending more than we know. The Yuba case deserves that kind of precision. It deserves the slow naming of known events, the careful marking of unknown ones, and the refusal to turn vulnerable men into props for a more dramatic story. Calmness here is not decorative. It is ethical. You can almost imagine placing small labels on the desk. Known, the game in Chico. Known, the market stop afterward. Known, the mercury found in the mountains. Known, several men later found in the forest region. Known, Ted survived in the trailer for some time. Known, Gary Mathias was not found. Unknown, why the car went there. Unknown, why the men left it. Unknown, the exact sequence after that. The labels help, but they do not heal the gaps. The road from unknown to known usually requires evidence. In this case, many potential evidence streams were fragile from the start. Tracks in snow, nighttime sightings, memory under stress, remote search conditions, weather-altered scenes. You can feel how each stream could fade before investigators reached it. The Yuba case is, in part, a study in evidence that existed briefly and then became unrecoverable. That thought can be sobering, but tonight we keep it quiet. Not every truth leaves a durable trace. A sentence spoken in a car leaves no mark unless someone survives to repeat it. A decision at a fork in the road leaves no signature unless the road records it. Footsteps in snow may last hours, or less. Detectives are often asked to reconstruct what the world did not preserve. Sometimes they can, sometimes they cannot. When they cannot, the file remains as a form of care. It says the question was asked. It says the search was made. It says the men's names were written, not forgotten. You can picture the folder returning to a cabinet, not as a burial of the case, but as a place of keeping. Metal drawers close with a low sound. The room grows still. The questions remain inside, waiting for the next careful hand. And when that next hand opens the Yuba case again, it may begin where we began, with the car. The car is tangible. It gives the mind something to hold. Its color, its fuel, its position, its condition, its owner's habits, all of these are easier to examine than fear or confusion. You can stand beside it in every review and ask the same first question. Why here? Why this road? Why stop? Then the file leads you away from the car because the men did not remain with it. It leads you along possible paths, through snow, toward the distant trailer. It asks you to imagine movement without making it too certain. It asks you to understand that 19 miles by road may not describe the exact path, only the scale of separation. You follow carefully, knowing that every imagined step must stay lighter than fact. At the trailer, you pause again. The air inside is still. The shelves hold supplies. The blankets remain in memory. Ted's presence tells you life continued there for a while, in hardship and isolation. If others were present, their care or decisions left too little for us to read. If Ted was alone, the questions become lonelier still. The file does not choose for us. It only places the room before us. From the trailer, the file opens outward again, to the locations where the others were found, and the absence where Gary was not. You can see how the investigation expands and thins at the same time. More ground, fewer answers. More discoveries, less certainty about sequence. The map becomes marked, but the line connecting the marks remains broken. Detectives could draw circles around places. They could not draw a confident path through all of them. This is the slow heart of why the Yuba case could not be cracked. It was not one locked door. It was several doors, each missing a different key. The first key was motive or cause for the mountain route. The second was the reason for leaving the car. The third was the sequence of travel to the trailer. The fourth was what happened inside and around that shelter. The fifth was Gary's final path. A detective might solve one of those doors and still face the others. If tomorrow someone proved why the car went into the mountains, the trailer questions would remain. If someone found Gary, his location might answer much, or only add another point to the map. If a witness explained the road, investigators would still ask why the supplies were left unused. The case's difficulty lies in that layered structure. Layered mysteries require stamina. They do not yield to one clever thought. They ask for years of returning, revising and letting go of weak ideas. You can sit with that stamina tonight as something almost restful. There is no need to hurry through the file. The men have been waiting in these pages for a long time. We can give them the courtesy of an unhurried reading. The old investigators likely had moments of frustration, though the reports may not show them. You can imagine a detective alone at a desk after another lead fades, rubbing tired eyes, then looking back at the same map. The office may smell of paper, dust, and cooled coffee. Outside, traffic moves normally. Inside, the turquoise mercury remains on the mountain road, unchanged in memory, refusing to explain itself. Frustration does not mean carelessness. It often means care has met a wall. Detectives are human, and cold cases can become personal in quiet ways. A case involving young men from close families, a preventable seeming route, and a missing final answer would be hard to set down. You can imagine an investigator hearing a family's question years later and wishing the file had one more solid page. Sometimes the absence of that page shapes an entire career's memory. There are cases detectives mention long after retirement, not because they were famous, but because they remained unfinished inside. The Yuba case has that quality. It is the kind of file that might sit in the back of the mind during a drive through winter hills, or when a young person is late coming home, or when snow begins to fall on a road that looks harmless at first. For us, tonight, the unfinished nature becomes part of the cadence. We move, pause, return, and move again. We do not look for a sharp ending. We look for understanding, and understanding can be partial. You can let the questions become slower now, even as we keep reading. The file is not closing. It is simply allowing us to notice how much patience unresolved truth requires. There is one more way to think about the mountain road, and it is through the idea of thresholds. The men crossed several that night without knowing their importance, leaving the game, leaving the market, leaving the expected route, leaving the car, entering the forest, entering the trailer. Each threshold may have felt ordinary, necessary, or temporary in the moment. Only later did each become a marked point in the case. Detectives work backward across thresholds. They ask what changed at each one. You can do that with them. At the game, nothing clearly wrong. At the market, still ordinary. On the road, unknown. At the car, a major change. At the trailer, survival and confusion. Beyond the trailer, disappearance and discovery. The trouble is that the most important threshold may have left the least evidence. The moment the route home was abandoned. That moment could have been as small as a turn signal blinking in the dark, a wheel turning, a road taken. You can hear the soft click of the indicator, or maybe there was none. The car follows the road, and for a while, the choice does not announce itself. This is how life often changes, quietly, with no music under it. The Yuba case reminds us that not every turning point feels like one while it happens. In that reminder, there is a kind of humility for all of us. We live by partial knowledge too. We choose routes, trust people, follow habits, and make decisions while tired. Most of the time, the world receives our small mistakes gently. We turn around, we call someone, we find our way back. For the 5 men in this case, whatever happened did not give them that ordinary mercy. The file does not ask us to be frightened by that. It asks us to be compassionate. It asks us to notice how much of safety depends on small supports, clear signs, warm shelter, good information, and people expecting us home. The men had some of those supports, and then, for reasons still unclear, they moved beyond them. Detectives spent years trying to understand how that happened. The question remains open in the quiet. As we continue, the winter landscape can settle back around the edges of the narration, not as threat, but as context. Snow on branches, the dull shine of a road where tires have packed the surface, the dense smell of pine and damp earth under thaw, the cold pressure in an unheated room. These are not decorations. They are the conditions in which evidence lived and changed. Evidence is never separate from its environment. A receipt, in a dry pocket, lasts differently than a footprint in snow. A car on a road is visible to anyone who passes, but only if someone passes. A building in the forest can preserve shelter and still conceal its occupant from searchers. You can feel how the Yuba case depends on these practical truths. The mystery is atmospheric, because the atmosphere itself affected what could be known. When investigators reviewed the abandoned Mercury, they had to distinguish mechanical possibility from human possibility. A car may be technically drivable, yet its driver may believe it is stuck. A vehicle may be freed by someone calm and skilled, yet feel impossible to someone tired, cold, or frightened. You can imagine the detective noting that the car could run, then still wondering what the men believed when they stood beside it. Belief in the moment matters. If they believed the car was unusable, they might leave. If they believed help was close, they might walk. If they believed they were in danger, they might move quickly. If they believed the road ahead led somewhere safer, they might continue in the wrong direction. Detectives could infer possible beliefs from actions, but they could not confirm them. The men's inner reasoning vanished with them. The same applies inside the trailer. Supplies may have been present, but what did the men believe about them? Did they know the food was there? Did they think they should conserve it? Did they know how to open containers? Did they fear using equipment? Did Ted become too weak? Did someone leave, intending to return? You can see how each material fact contains a hidden human interpretation. This is why old mysteries are not solved by objects alone. Objects need context. A can of food is not only food. It is food found or unfound, opened or unopened, understood or overlooked. A blanket is not only fabric. It is warmth, care, confusion, or insufficiency. A pair of shoes is not only footwear. It is movement, exchange, injury, or absence. In the Yuba case, objects speak softly and never quite enough. The quiet detective learns to listen anyway. You turn one object slightly in your mind, then another. You compare them without forcing a sentence they cannot say. The work can feel almost meditative, though it is grounded in loss. That is the unusual emotional texture of patient cold casework. It can be calm and painful at the same time, because calm is the method, not the meaning. The men's families likely had their own interpretations, hopes, and doubts. Families often know things investigators cannot fully weigh. They know whether someone would take a risk, whether someone would follow a friend, whether someone would fear the dark, whether someone would share food, whether someone would try to walk for help. You can imagine those family convictions meeting the official need for evidence, sometimes aligning, sometimes not. Neither side is complete alone. Family knowledge is intimate, but grief can sharpen or blur it. Official evidence is disciplined, but it can miss the texture of a life. The best reading of the Yuba case respects both. We listen to the family's sense of who the men were, and we listen to the record's limits. Where they do not meet, we do not pretend they do. We let the space remain visible. The case's long life in public discussion has also produced comparisons to other mysteries. But each case has its own climate. Some cold cases are solved by a single overlooked suspect. Some by genealogy, some by a confession, some by recovered remains. The Yuba case is different because its known facts suggest a tragic journey, yet the reason for that journey and its precise sequence remain hidden. Comparison can help us think, but it cannot solve the particular road. Particularity matters. This road, this car, this group, this night, this weather, this tournament, this trailer. You can repeat those particulars as a way of staying grounded. The more specific we are, the less likely we are to drift into vague mystery. Detectives live in particulars. A mile marker, a receipt time, a road condition, a shoe size, a family statement. The old file is made of particulars, even when the answer is not. If you were the detective tonight, you might set aside a clean sheet and write the timeline again. Evening game in Chico. Market stop afterward. Failure to return to Yuba City. Car found in the mountains days later. Searches through difficult winter terrain. Spring thaw. Trailer discovery in June. Ted found inside. Others found in the region. Gary not found. You would leave wide spaces between some lines, because those spaces are the case. Wide spaces can be honest on a page. They show where evidence stops. They prevent the mind from smoothing over gaps too quickly. You can imagine drawing a line from the market to the car. then stopping because the line represents travel but not cause. Another line from the car to the trailer, then stopping because it represents possible movement but not certainty. The page becomes a map of knowledge and humility together. Humility may be the closest thing this case gives us to a lesson. Detectives could know much and still not know enough. Families could love deeply and still not receive the full truth. Public attention could grow and still not produce the missing fact. The Yuba case stayed unsolved, not because it lacked emotion or effort, but because the evidence preserved only parts of a human sequence that unfolded in cold and darkness. Even now, when people revisit it, they often bring fresh eyes but not fresh evidence. Fresh eyes can be useful. They can challenge assumptions and notice overlooked inconsistencies. But without new information, they can also circle the same rooms. You can feel that circular motion in discussions of the case. The car, the road, the trailer, the food, Gary. Back to the car, back to the road. The circle continues because the line is broken. A patient listener does not need to escape the circle. Tonight, the circle can become the rhythm. We return to the road and find it still quiet. We return to the trailer and find the air still cold. We return to the families and remember the waiting. We return to the detectives and see them turning the pages again. Nothing sharp happens in that return. It is simply how unresolved care behaves over time. The landscape has changed since 1978. As landscapes do, roads may be improved, signs altered, trees grown or cleared, buildings changed, memories thinned. You can stand in a present-day place and feel the danger of assuming it matches the past. Detectives reviewing old cases must account for that. The road you drive now may not be the road they faced then. The snow line, the access, the traffic, the visibility, all may differ. Photographs and reports preserve some of the past, but not all. They cannot preserve the exact cold against skin, the fatigue after walking, the fear of not knowing where the road leads. You can use imagination to approach those things, but not to replace evidence. That is the balance of this narration. We imagine sensory conditions to remain human, while keeping factual claims modest. The Yuba case needs both restraint and empathy. As the file grows quieter in your hands, you may notice that the men's planned game the next day keeps glowing softly behind everything. It is almost like a porch light in the story, not bright enough to explain the road, but steady enough to remind us where they were supposed to be. A tournament, teammates, a schedule, family expectations, ordinary pride. That next day never arrived for them in the way it should have. And detectives knew that mattered. The tournament detail also helps challenge any theory of casual wandering. It anchors intention. They meant to return. You can feel the strength of that anchor, even though the line broke somewhere in the night. Many cold cases have such anchors. A shift at work, a child to pick up, a meal planned, an appointment kept in mind. These details do not solve the case, but they tell us what direction life was facing before interruption. Interruption is perhaps the gentlest word for the unknown event or decision. It does not assume crime. It does not assume accident. It simply says the expected line was interrupted. The Yuba case is the study of that interruption, traced through roads, snow, shelter, and absence. You and I can leave the word open. Somewhere after the market and before the car was found, interruption entered the evening. From there, the investigation becomes an effort to hear its outline. A witness account might be one edge, the mountain route another, the car's condition another, the trailer another, Gary's absence another. Put together, they form a shape, but not a clear picture. You can imagine holding thin tracing paper over a faded drawing. Some lines show through, others vanish just when you need them most. The detective's inability to crack the case, then, was not a lack of a question. It was too many necessary questions, each dependent on facts unavailable from the beginning. The men could not tell their story. The road did not record it. The snow did not keep it long enough. The trailer preserved aftermath, not origin. Gary's missing body withheld one of the last possible witnesses in physical form. The case remained open-ended by its very structure. Open-ended does not mean empty. We have many things to hold. We hold the 5 names. We hold the communities that searched. We hold the families who waited. We hold the investigators who kept returning to details that would not align. We hold the ordinary start and the remote ending. The Yuba case is full of human material, even if it lacks the final explanatory sentence. That final sentence is what everyone wants, of course. It would say why. It would connect Chico to the mountain, the car to the trailer to the men's separate fates, and Gary's absence to a known place. You can feel the mind reaching for it, but the file does not give it. Instead, it gives fragments. And patient detective work means treating fragments as fragments, not forcing them to become a whole they cannot yet form. Perhaps someday a new search, a rediscovered document, or a credible late witness will shift the file. Cold cases have surprised investigators before. You can allow that possibility without leaning on it too hard. Hope in old cases should be gentle, not demanding. It should leave room for the reality that some answers may never be recovered. The Yuba case sits precisely in that tender space between continuing interest and enduring silence. For tonight, we remain with the pages already in front of us. The lamp is low, the room is quiet. The old paper smells faintly of dust and time. Outside the imagined window, the world can go on being ordinary, with cars passing, refrigerators humming, and someone rinsing a cup in a distant kitchen. Inside the file, the mercury is still on the mountain road, and we are still asking carefully why it came to rest there. You turn back to the map once more, not because it has changed, but because returning is part of the work. Chico lies to one side, Yuba City to another, and the forest roads climb away into a different kind of night. Your finger follows the expected route home, then lifts and finds the mountain location. The space between them feels larger than miles. It is filled with all the words no one heard. The next page may be an interview with someone who knew Jack Madruga. You read about his care for the car and his usual caution. The description is ordinary, but it matters. People reveal themselves through ordinary care. Keeping a vehicle clean, avoiding rough roads, knowing when something does not sound right under the hood. If Jack would not normally risk the mercury, then the mountain road demands a reason. The file does not supply one, but the question becomes sharper. Then you read about Bill Sterling and Jack Hewitt, and the closeness of their friendship softens the map. You might imagine them staying near each other if the group became afraid. Perhaps that closeness influenced where they moved, or how long they remained together. We cannot know, but we can refuse to treat them as isolated markers. Friends move through trouble differently than strangers. They listen for one another's voices. Ted Wire's section brings you back to the trailer, to survival, and to the painful evidence of time passing. You can feel the cold floor, the rough blanket, the stale air, and the muted daylight entering a remote room. Ted's presence there remains one of the case's most human and difficult facts. It shows endurance. It suggests hardship. It raises questions about care, supplies, and why the shelter did not become rescue. Gary Mathias's section remains open at the edge. You read his name and feel the file thin out. There are references, possibilities, and the fact that he was not found. His army service, his mental health history, his reported stability, his friendship with the group, and his missing status all sit together. You do not choose one detail to explain the rest. You let the whole person remain more than the theory built around him. The more carefully you read, the more the 5 men come forward as individuals. That individuality does not solve the Yuba case, but it deepens the responsibility of telling it. A mystery about 5 people must not become a machine for speculation. It must remain a human account, with each life given space. Detectives know this. At least the good ones do. Evidence belongs to people before it belongs to puzzles. And so, as the pages continue, we keep the pace low and even. We let the investigation breathe. We do not chase the next theory too quickly. We allow the cold road to remain cold, the car to remain still, the trailer to remain quiet, and the family's questions to remain dignified. The Yuba case is difficult enough without sharpening it. Its own facts are enough to hold us. There is a small comfort, maybe, in knowing that patient attention still gathers around the men after all these years. Not the comfort of resolution, but the comfort of being remembered accurately and gently. You can imagine someone hearing the case for the first time and learning the names, not just the label. You can imagine another person correcting a careless retelling. These acts do not solve the mystery, but they keep respect alive. Respect is not passive. It shapes what questions we ask and how we ask them. It keeps us from turning vulnerability into blame. It keeps us from treating uncertainty as permission to invent. It keeps the evidence in proportion. In the Yuba case, respect means admitting that detectives could never crack it because the crucial moments were not preserved, while still honoring the painstaking work done around every trace that was. The file remains under your hand, and the next sheet waits. Its edge is slightly uneven. The ink is plain. Somewhere in its lines, a deputy may have recorded road conditions, or a family member's recollection, or another lead that went nowhere. We turn it anyway. The quiet work continues, because in old cases, continuing is sometimes the only form of care left available. The Yuba case never gave detectives the final answer they kept reaching for, and that is where the truth of it rests, quietly and plainly. No one has ever been charged with causing what happened to the 5 men. Gary Mathias has never been found, and the central questions of the mountain road, the abandoned Mercury, and the long cold distance to the trailer remain unresolved to this day. Some parts of the file are known, and some parts are not. And after all these years, the unknown parts still keep their place. You can let that be enough for tonight, not because the questions are unimportant, but because no honest telling should pretend to close what life left open. The detectives did what patient people do. They searched, recorded, asked, returned, and waited. The families carried the names farther than any report could carry them, through seasons and anniversaries, through quiet rooms and remembered voices, through the ordinary years that kept arriving after that February night. Now the old folder can rest beneath the lamp. The paper does not need to be turned again. The road is still there in the mind, pale under winter trees, and the car is still silent where the searchers first found it. But you do not have to stand beside it any longer. You can step back from the map, leaving the marked places where they are, with all their distance and all their unanswered care. Some mysteries do not end with a door opening. They end with a room growing still, with the names spoken gently, with the evidence placed back in order, and with the understanding that attention itself can be a form of respect. The Yuba case remains unsolved, and the quiet around it remains too. But for now the file can close softly, the lamp can dim, and the night can hold what no one was able to finish.